really disappointed about this tractor, and not to say that every 4610 is like this, but I think it was built on a Monday. All right, so here we have a Massey Ferguson 4610 3-cylinder turboed engine. I always liked Massey's, but never really got into the new ones just yet until this one. Customers complained about some water or milky oil. Went down, verified it. Yep, absolutely, you got water going into the oil. Did an oil change on the engine just so that they can get it in the shop, and we need to diagnose and figure out what is going on. Basically going to start with removing the head. We want to make sure that the head gasket is okay, that it didn't hydrolock. We want to measure those pistons and go from there. Here we go.
Oh, yeah, definitely the head gasket.
Yeah, no doubt about that. That's not what's supposed to be on your valve cover. I hope that it's so severe that the head gasket is so far blown apart that when they crank it over and it's got the coolant sitting on top of the piston, that it's able to squirt it out through the head gasket and relieve the pressure. Because yeah, it was still running good when we checked it out. It wasn't running when we got it. The intake was, or the exhaust was right full of coolant. So hopefully that turbo is okay too. So when you're taking rockers apart and heads, when you're tightening it, you start in the middle and you work your way out. When you're loosening it, you start from the outside and work your way in. So crack the outsides loose. Good practice to back off the sets at the back so you don't warp the rockers. But when you're taking the head off, start cracking them from the outside and work your way loose, and that will prevent warping it from the outside. We're actually really disappointed with this tractor so far that it's not very tight. These bolts holding the intake was just like, you could have taken them apart with a 1/4-inch ratchet. And the lines on the injectors, everything was just barely on there. Initially, can't see anything wrong with the bottom of the head. And I can't see any lines. Generally, when a head gasket blows, there's a line between the head and one of the gaskets, but all the heads were, actually all the cylinders were full of water. I think I found the problem. Our wonderful EGR cooler here. If you plug this one and blow it, you can feel it leaking through.
If you can hear it, you shouldn't.
No, you shouldn't hear that. Don't tell my wife I do this. So you can see all the coolant on the inside of that too. So I'm positive we have an EGR cooler leak. Do we eliminate the EGR? Because it's as simple as just connecting this hose to that. Yeah. I'll leave that up to the customer. So I think this cooler is shot, and that's what did it. Still had to pull the whole head apart because we still have to clean everything and dry everything and flush everything. But I think the EGR cooler went and not the head gasket. We're gonna save all the money we can, but I can't see anything. It's hard to see with the camera, but the head gasket actually looks good, which is kind of disappointing. That's actually really, really bad. The coolant is going through the cooler and blowing into the exhaust, and whatever exhaust valve is open, that's where the coolant runs into. Now when you crank it over, the exhaust valve closes and that coolant has nowhere to go. So now you're hydrolocking that piston and you have the potential to bend a rod. As nice as this emissions crap is, it just about took out another engine. We're gonna vacuum this out, clean it out, put dial indicator on it, make sure that none of the rods are bent. Unfortunately, if it was one head gasket that was clearly blown, you could compare the height from one piston to another piston, but now we got to get some specs from Massey and see what the distance is supposed to be from the top of the piston to the top of the liner. So put a straight edge across and do with feeler gauges or a dial indicator that you can rotate and drop from the edge down and see what the difference is, and then compare that to what Massey says it's supposed to be, because we do have potential for a bent rod. Shit. We're finding top dead center of the piston. Now we'll find the difference between the block and the liner. Slide that over. So that is 30, 35, 37 thou difference. We'll write that down. Liner to piston, 34. Yeah, 34. Okay. Do number 3, write it down, then do our subtractions and see what it actually is. So
across the board is 37 thou liner protrusion, which is actually really good and amazing that they got it like that. You could measure from the block to the piston directly, but you got to put the needle over the liner. That's why we go from block to liner and then liner to piston. Number 3 is 28 thou, number 2 is 34 thou, and number 1 is 27 thou. So this one and this one are probably okay. Number 2 is definitely bent because it's 6 thou deeper, and that's quite excessive actually. It might not seem like it, but it is. If it was a break in the headline or in the head gasket, then say it was between number 1 and number 2, and number 3 would be your reference point. That could be guaranteed that's still original, but because it was EGR and all of them are full of coolant, doesn't mean that this is the spec that it's supposed to be. We're guessing, but all 3 of them could be bent. So we're trying to wait for a spec for what they're supposed to be, but they're not being too cooperative, and most shops don't like giving out information like that to people fixing it themselves. But I would be safe to say that we have 3 bent connecting rods. I'm not gonna replace one without replacing the other 2. So now
safest bet would be all of them.
Yeah. So yeah, I gotta call the customer and break the good news that they won't have their tractor for like a week, and it'll be thousands.
Take more stuff off.
Okay, here we go. So there are no shortcuts. You have to roll the front of this tractor away to get the oil pan off so we can get the rods out. It's turning into a big mess. Glad we went this far though, because all the bolts were loose. There was only a handful that were tight, and most of them were loose, not only on the loader but on the tractor itself. Very disappointing on that. Generally when the loader goes on, it would be done at the dealership, and it has nothing to do with Massey themselves. It's just whoever's doing it at the time. So a couple things to note is just don't drain your AC. Just take your condenser right out, move it and put it inside the cab out of the way. There's also a plug at the front here, which is kind of a pain. It feeds 3 fuses, your 60, 40, and 100 amp, and the main wire coming in there, just give it a little tug. That's a spade connector to come out, or there's a tool you can push the tab in. Just pull the tab out, then you can stick your wire out through there. Once we get the pan off, we can pull the rods out, and I think we get our parts this afternoon. We can throw some new rods in there and put her back together again. Make sure that you blow all the coolant or any fluids out of the bolt holes. If you don't, there's nowhere for the fluid to go. When you torque the bolt down, it'll actually risk cracking the block or improper torque settings on your head bolts, or any bolts for that matter, because they're bottoming out on the fluid inside. Different ways to put the bearing on. Some people dip them in oil all the way. I usually stick white lithium grease on one side and then pop it in, making sure the tabs go in the right spot. Connecting rods, you get fed oil pressure from the crankshaft. So usually the bearings are solid. The crankshaft will have a hole in one bearing, and that will have to go up into the block, not into the cap. If you put the solid bearing on the crankshaft on the top, you'll starve the crank with oil, and it'll run for about 2 minutes before it seizes on it. We're not replacing the rings because it's a brand new engine, but we stagger the rings on the wrist pin here. So one on this side, one on the opposite side of the wrist pin, and then the oil one on the bottom, the same one as on the top. Make sure that the liner is nice and clean. There was still really good crosshatch on it. There's no ringland. There's nothing to worry about that way. If you do turn it over in a wet sleeve, put a washer on it. If you're worried about it, put a washer around it to sit on the liner so that the liner doesn't pop up. Not too worried about that. We're gonna brake clean the liner and the crank journal, lube it right up with oil, and drop the piston in. Arrow goes to the front, and the rods are directional too, so however you take them out, put them back the same way. We had numbers on the connecting rod facing the booth there. Put your piston ring compressor on it, and tap it in. Put the crank at the bottom, pull the piston down from the bottom. Torque specs are 27.5 to 32.6 or something like that, which I don't find is a lot, but we are going to Loctite them and go to the high end of that. That seems like a low torque to me, but
Had the guy check it twice, read it the service manual, so here we go. This one only fits on one way. Put it on. So torquing the head down, these ones go up to 65 foot-pounds. You start in the middle, work your way out. Conversely, if you're taking the head off, you start from the outside and work your way in. Doing it in 3 steps is always a good idea to torque the head down evenly to prevent warping. Adding a extension to your torque wrench doesn't change the torque. The torque will, if there is any twist in the extension, it'll twist and then it'll pull the socket with it. If you're using an impact gun for anything, it bounces on the extension, you'll lose torque, you won't be able to get it as tight. Okay, so we're doing a bearing roll, main bearing roll. You want to see the trick to this, just click on the link where I did it on the John Deere rather than doing it all over again. So keep going there, turn it, same direction. Bit more, bit more. Okay, whoop, right there, back it off. Yeah, perfect. A 3-cylinder is different from 4-cylinder because you don't have opposing cylinders. So when the exhaust is open on number 2, you can set number 3. When the exhaust is open on number 3, you can set number 1. And when the exhaust is open on number 1, you can set number 2.
Right?
I think so. I don't pay much, but at least you can cancel your gym membership. We should just grab the jack.
Okay.
Told you we should have used the jack.
Only the first time. Should have put a block of wood under it.
Yeah. No codes, no lights on. That's good. Because we were waiting 2 weeks for 1 rod bearing. They sent us 2, couldn't get us the 3rd rod bearing. And the antifreeze went through the bearing. The bearing was like scratched and shiny. The crank was fine, so I had to put new bearings in it. There's no way I would put it back together with the used bearing. So sounds good, power's there. We're full RPM. No other noises, just want to make sure there's no leaks, and then we'll throw the hood on and it's back to the customer again. Every single thing that's on the side of that block, when we took some fitting off to get the head off, it had a sensor on it. Way too many sensors. I don't understand the amount of sensors that have to be on these things. Now, the story is that something hit the overflow tank and they lost coolant, but they swore they kept a good eye on the temperature gauge and that it never really got that hot. I know they're conscious of it. They blow the rad out constantly with a backpack blower. I don't think it's the right machine for them, mainly because there's rad, an intercooler, an oil cooler, and the AC condenser, and another cooler for something or other. The technician that I talked to get the torque specs from and the valve lash settings for, he said, well, a case has a 10-year warranty on anything emissions, so I don't know if Massey does or not. We're gonna look into that. When we originally picked up the tractor, I talked to the customer and said, like, is there warranty? It's pretty new, 2 years old. And they said, no, we looked into it, no warranty. So that's another reason to not get a Massey if a case has a warranty and Massey doesn't. My opinion on this tractor is unfortunately 2 thumbs down. And I was always a big Massey fan. I loved the old 3000 series tractors and the old 265s and 1135s. They were good in their time, and they've long since become obsolete. But at least you don't run into this crap.